In the last section, we started positioning our elements. As a reminder, we're using the concept of Flexbox to lay out all of our content. We're planning our Flexbox ahead of time by using a color-coded mockup. The mockup was divided into a header and a footer, and then inside the header we additionally had a timer wrapper and a button wrapper. Each of these were color-coded differently. We made the container, the header, and the footer styles. Each of them had Flex 1. The container had Flex 1 to make sure that it filled up the entire screen. The two children, header and footer, both got Flex 1, which means that they fill up the container equally and divide that area in half because they're both children with Flex equal to 1. The one thing that we didn't do in the last section was made sure to apply the container, header, and footer styles to elements in our view. So let's do that now. Our container is the topmost level view. So we'll add style is styles.container. The header is the view that contains the timer and the two buttons. So we'll get style is styles.header. And finally, the footer is the view that contains the list of laps, which we'll implement in the future. So let's go ahead and save this, and it looks good. So you'll notice, like I just said, by adding header and footer with Flex 1, which are children of container, they split the area of container equally. I want to start by showing you a little trick that I find extremely helpful for laying out Flexbox items. We're going to add another helper function in here. So we'll call it border. This function will take a single argument called color, and it's going to return an object. This object will have two properties, border color, which will be equal to border, and border width will be equal to 4. So if you recall from the last app that we built, we made several functions that were helper functions for producing some styling for us. And the styling was always dynamic. That's why we put it inside of a function. This border function works just the same way. Depending on the input, we'll get some different styling back, namely the color of the border. This is a super helpful trick that I've found for laying out Flexbox items, because we can put a border for certain elements on the page that is the same color as the colors that are in our mockup here. So for example, our header will get a yellow border, our footer will get a blue border, and so on. So let's add those styles in. First, we'll add it to the timer wrapper. So we'll say style, this dot border, and our timer wrapper is red, so we'll say red. Next, our button wrapper, this dot border green. And then we need to apply it to the header and the footer as well. But this probably raises a question for you. How do we add a style to an element that already has a style? Well, fortunately, it's super easy. All we have to do is pass in an array here instead of a single object. So I'll wrap styles.header in an array, and then we'll add another element to it, this.border yellow, and then the footer will get a color of blue. So we'll add another array, this.border blue. Awesome. Let's go ahead and refresh the simulator, and boom, here's all of our elements with a nice border on it so we can tell what's what. Now, it might not seem like it's that useful right now, right? We kind of already knew that the timer was up here. We knew that the button wrapper was green. It was right here, et cetera, et cetera. But trust me, the first time you go to do a Flexbox layout by yourself, I highly recommend you use this style right here because it can get really confusing really quick. I find one of the most frustrating things about Flexbox is to add styles or add additional flex properties to different elements, and then I refresh the simulator and I can't always tell exactly what the difference was or if anything changed at all. So I really highly recommend you give it a shot. whenever you do your own layout. Okay, so now that we can see the full extent of each of these elements, let's take another glance at the code that we just wrote, just to review. The purpose of creating this border function here was to make it easier to see the full extent of all of our items. React Native doesn't have an inspector like Chrome Console, where we can mouse over an element on the page, like an HTML element, and get a nice highlight of its position and see its height and width on the screen. This sometimes makes figuring out the whole extent of our elements pretty darn challenging. One workaround to this is to set a border on each of these elements. When you're starting out with Flexbox, this really is, again, it's an awesome visual aid. We added a border to each of our wrapping elements by creating this border function. This function takes a color argument and then returns some rules to create a border. Because our wrapping elements, the header and the footer, already had styles in them, we had to use a slightly different syntax to add an additional style. And all we did was add an array, and we added this second style as a second element inside of that array. Now, it certainly would have been very easy to just come on down here and say, border color yellow, blah, blah, blah. But, we don't want to mess up all of our real styling quite so easy. So I find it to be just a little bit easier to use a helper function like this. So now that we have a better handle on the sizing of each of our elements, let's continue in the next section.